Good morning. So I was asked to do a presentation on what constitutes good water quality. And what I'm challenged to do is make it into something that makes sense and is relevant, highly relevant to people who take care of fish, either for themselves or for somebody else, or quite often in a retail environment, so that they can effectively manage water quality. Fact of the matter is that water quality is the underpinning of all fish health. Less than half of the parasites and bacteria that affect fish can even get a foothold in water quality that is good. For example, Epistylus and Trichodina have a hard time surviving in really clean water with low organic material, and I guess I could explain that later. I have a specific direction in this presentation, however, and that is what constitutes good water. So then I asked myself, how does this subject mean anything to someone who shares responsibility with the customer for their pond and fish health? More simply stated, why should I care? So I'm going to make this presentation in sort of a question and answer format so that you can understand the purpose of what I'm saying and the question of what I'm trying to answer on behalf of the listener. And I think the first question I'd like to answer is, why are ecosystem ponds the best water quality? Well, one of the reasons actually is the incorporation of plants into the design. Plants are tremendous for water quality. They utilize excessive amounts of nitrogen from the nitrogen cycle. They have water purification functions. They secrete plant agglutinins, which I will talk about in some detail later. The submerged plants can produce oxygen during the day, although they produce carbon dioxide at night, and I'll talk about that. These ecosystem ponds also typically have a layer of gravel, not a thick layer, but a layer of gravel on the bottom, which exponentially increases the biofilm layer. Biofilm is a layer of bacteria and other organisms that purify water, including things like Ambifraia, which are filter feeders that eat bacteria. Yay! So there are other organisms that can clarify the water, but also that the fish can eat as they sift through the gravel. The other reason ecosystem ponds are very good as far as water quality, or perhaps have the best water quality, is because oxygen tensions are usually high in ecosystem ponds. Most ecosystem ponds these days are constructed with a waterfall that has a lot to do with aeration of the system. And they're engineered so that the waterfall is on one side of the pond and the filtration system or skimmer is on the other side. So freshly oxygenated water is naturally drawn to the skimmer across the pond. So for the most part, if it's designed right, there aren't very many stagnant areas being exposed to fresh oxygenated water. Carbon dioxide levels are usually pretty good in an ecosystem pond because they have a lot of surface area most of the time. And the waterfall also degasses carbon dioxide. Which brings me to another question that you might have. Don't carbon dioxide levels and oxygen levels go hand in hand? Like in air, oxygen levels, when they're high, mean that the levels of other oxygen or other gases in the air are low. So in the air, you cannot have high oxygen levels and high carbon dioxide levels, but in water, that's totally different. So in water, you can have high oxygen levels and high carbon dioxide levels. That's comparatively rare because the processes by which you'd have high oxygen levels, the processes by which oxygen levels would be maintained at a high level are also the processes by which carbon dioxide would be kept at a relatively low level. So they kind of, by the mechanics of it, they're mutually exclusive, but they can occur concurrently. For example, let's just say that you have a lot of bioload going in the system. You have, it's nighttime and you've got plants churning out carbon dioxide. You've got the fish churning out carbon dioxide and bacteria in the system all churning out carbon dioxide. And you have a fair level of oxygenation. but you also have a ton of carbon dioxide going on, and the behavior of carbon dioxide in water is to form carbonic acid. And in soft water, that can bring the pH down. So sometimes there are circumstances, naturally created circumstances, where high carbon dioxide levels exist and can negatively impact the system, especially in the area of pH. As a side note, if you ever used Alka-Seltzer for anesthetizing fish, basically what you were doing was artificially increasing the carbon dioxide levels in the water, regardless of how much oxygen. You were increasing the carbon dioxide levels to the point where you basically smothered the fish out. They essentially pass out. No big deal. Not a lot of fish died. We just use oil of cloves these days. So we talked a little bit about the plants and how sometimes during the day they produce oxygen, during the day they produce oxygen, and at night they produce carbon dioxide. So somebody might want to know, could you briefly help me understand about submerged plants and the way they do during the day and what they do during the night? Sure. So plants, and this has a lot to do with submerged plants like Anacris and Kabamba, Bacopa, Vallisneria, etc. Those plants, when they're hit with oxygen, they're making sugar, and they're making sugar out of carbon. They need that to make the sugar. And so they use carbon dioxide during the day and produce oxygen during the day and store that as food. And then at night, they use that to grow. So they're unlocking the sugars that they synthesize during the day, and they release the carbon dioxide back into the water as they use the sugars for their own body's growth and repair and metabolism. So plants are, I wouldn't call them a double-edged sword, but I think it's important for people to know that the, quote, oxygenators are basically oxygenating during the day, which is good because water is typically warmer during the day, and warmer water carries less oxygen. So it's kind of a nifty thing. In the evening, as water temperatures are a little bit cooler and the sun has gone down, it's more okay that the plants are producing CO2 or carbon dioxide. However, as you know from what I just said before, when the plants are producing carbon dioxide at night, it does have a tendency to reduce the pH a little bit by way of carbonic acid. Now, if you live in the northeastern United States where your water is soft-ish, that's more of a problem than it is in Nevada, where all of the water is from evaporation off of some rocks. That water is super hard. They don't have pH fluctuations as much. So you would need to test in your area your daytime and nighttime pH levels and your alkalinity. That is the subject of another conversation if you have any questions. Do floating plants have as much of an impact on oxygen levels? The answer is no, not so much. And the cool thing about floating plants, though, is that they provide shade. They use tons of nitrate, more nitrate usually than the slower growing submerged plants. And their roots produce what are called agglutinins. Then the question is, what are agglutinins? This is one of my favorite things because we look at people, for example, and animals as the hunters, and they have to hunt their food and then shoot their food and drag it down, and then they can eat it. Well, plants have a very similar thing. Certain parts of a plant are capable of producing these sticky proteins called agglutinins, and they release these sticky proteins into the water, and everywhere they encounter organic material, even bacteria, these sticky proteins agglutinate on these bits of detritus and little particulate debris and make them heavier than water so that they settle out. And then you might say, okay, how is that a plant hunting for its prey? Well, when it stickies everything together, the detritus and little particles and bacteria and all these little agglutinated molecules have a tendency to settle out, either on the soil at the bottom or in the gravel at the bottom of the pond where the roots of the plant can use them, or they sticky these particles to the roots of the plant. either way, the detritus and particles and bacteria and all that other stuff are sticking into the biofilm gravel or plant roots and not in the water, affecting the fish's gills and your ability to appreciate the fish with a high degree of clarity in clear water. So plant agglutinins are really, really excellent. I would say important. And I think that when you're missing plants, that you're missing out. And you might say, wait, I want plants, but I don't want my fish in and around them. Okay, well, it's not going to be as effective, but you can make a veggie filter that could either be a big cage of floating plants in the tank with the roots protected by the caging, and there is a bunch of images and how to make on my website. And then you can also use high flow bogs, where you basically make an extra pond and you circulate your water through that. And if it's rich in plant material, especially floating plants with roots that hang down, you can get a lot of water purification from that. Again, that's a more natural looking veggie filter. And there's a lot to be said for those. So you don't have to have your plants in with the fish in order to get the benefit of the plants. But the key element, really, when challenged with the idea of saying, well, what water quality is the most important, most relevant, is, I would say, the not quite as easy stuff is water clarity. Yeah. So hazes in the water are always sign of trouble. And there are at least 2, possibly 3 or 4 different kinds of hazes. Hazes is just water cloudiness. And by far the worst cloudiness that you can get is a bacterial bloom, which is just kind of a cloudy, unhealthy looking water. Sometimes a bacterial bloom is so bad you can actually smell it coming off the pond. And you can get bacterial blooms if a fish dies or something, is wedged down behind a rock, and you've got 1.5 pounds of dying, rotting tissue there. That can cause a bacterial haze. But there's a lot of other causes for both bacterial and other hazes as well. So if a haze is present, if water's hazy, there's a problem 90% of the time. Less than 10% of the time are you going to have a haze that doesn't really matter. Even what they call mineral hazes, which is basically just when let's say you fill a new-ish pond up, or you put a bunch of new gravel in, and the dust from the rocks comes up, that's a mineral haze, which is basically just a soon to settle out mineral dust. And in an established pond, that settles out very quickly because it's heavier than water and the biofilm grabs it. But mineral hazes also, if they're left unattended, mineral hazes can cause the gills to secrete excess mucus and start clubbing if it lasts too long. So I'm going to go over the hazes just a little bit, like, what hazes and why are these hazes such a big deal. And let's talk about Greenwater Hazes. That's where the water just has a greenish tint. And that's basically a pond that's either on the verge of, or just coming out of, or being treated by, or for algae. So a Greenwater haze is not that big of a deal. The water's just a little cloudy with some algae, and it's usually temporary, and dropping the nitrates, partial water change, and getting some more live plants in the system will take care of that. Time, no big deal. Mineral hazes will precipitate out of the water, and they clear pretty quickly, and they're easily cleared with flocculating agents. Plant agglutinins work on those water changes, rinsing any gravel or rocks that you put in the system thoroughly before you put them in there. But short-term mineral hazes, really not that big of a deal. Long-term mineral hazes, more of a big deal, because these minerals will precipitate out onto the gills, and they can be kind of irritating. That can cause the gills to start to produce a little bit more mucus. Then as the gills produce more mucus, the fish respires more poorly, getting a little bit less oxygen, thereby being a kind of a stressor. Now, bacterial hazes are, in my opinion, disastrous, and usually speak to low dissolved oxygen levels, or insufficient water agitation, and a lack of an equilibrium in the system. If bacterial hazes are hard to get when you have a good sticky biofilm, They're hard to get when you have a lot of flourishing plants, like later in the summer when the plant roots are all churning out agglutinins and using nitrates, and the system is at equilibrium. Bacterial hazes in an established system are usually going to be because something died in there, or some kid came by and dumped in a whole pound of food accidentally. But typically bacterial hazes occur in a new system, and they need to be dealt with. And one of the ways that I like to deal with that, any of the hazes actually, is sponge filtration, and there are some really good economical sponge filters out there. Even if you ran them temporarily, they make a sponge filter that can handle up to 250 gallons. So even if you were running 1,000 gallons, you technically could get 4 of those, probably spend $100. But at least then you'd run those 4 distributed around 1,000 gallons, and then you would just use like API's AccuClear, which is just a polyionic plasticizing solution that flocculates out microparticles, and that'll clear a haze very, very quickly. So sponge filtration and a flocculating agent are one of the ways to handle hazes, and especially if you suspect it's a bacterial haze, I highly recommend you jump on that with temporary or permanent sponge filtration and something like AccuClear flocculating agent. So another question that comes up, why do you think that nitrates are the ultimate kick in the head, even for advanced hobbyists? And the answer to that basically starts with an explanation of nitrates in the most basic terms. The nitrogen cycle is a contorted mishmash of ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. And you might ask yourself, do I really need to know the cycle, every part of it, and exactly what's going on down to the last hydroxyl ion? The answer is kind of no. So do you need to know the cycle? Yes and no is really the answer. So the nitrogen cycle is extremely important, especially when you first open an ecosystem. It takes several kinds of bacteria and other organisms to control the nitrogen, which is the equivalent of fish pee, by the way. And it actually leaks out of the fish through the gills, 75% of it, and then the fish pee the other 25% into the environment. We're just about exactly the opposite, actually. We pee 75% of our nitrogen, and 25% of our nitrogen leaks out through our sweat. Yeah, gross. But there is a parallel between the nitrogen cycle and a car. Most of us are familiar when the dashboard light comes on indicating that there's a problem with your car. And some people are like, oh, yeah, I know what that dashboard light means. I can fix that myself. And so a dashboard light, even if it's not very specific, means a lot to some of the advanced car owners. But the majority of people see an engine light and they're like, okay, I need to check with somebody or do something about this. Well, I think most people are in that category. I'm going somewhere with this, so stay tuned. If you use water test kits, the water test kit that I like these days is now a water test strip. And Tetra, and they may not be alone with this, Tetra has come out with one that tests everything. Used to be, their ammonia test strip was on a different test strip. Hopefully the video is showing you a picture of a Tetra test strip, but it tests ammonia, nitrate, pH, total alkalinity, and maybe a couple of other less important things. But when it's like your engine light, it doesn't have to be terribly accurate as long as it shows, oh, I have ammonia accumulation, or, oh, my nitrites are higher than they should be, or my nitrates are crazy high. Even if you didn't know right off the bat what those were, you just ran a $1 test and it showed you an abnormality, then you can crack a book and figure out what you need to do, which most of the time is just a water change, replace water, suspend feeding. There's even things that bind ammonia, improve your filtration with bioseeding or just adding more biomedia, increasing the circulation turnover in your filtration system, speed up your waterfall, whatever. So what you're really looking for is a test of the nitrogen cycle that just tells you something's wrong. And there's going to be some really old wizened guys in some British message board that's going to go, oh, no, you need to know the ammonia level to the 10th of a point. And it's kind of, okay, well, yeah, maybe you do, whatever, if that's how you get your joy. And you can urinate on people who use water test strips if that makes you feel good. But what I'm advising the librarian and the fireman and Vito de Pascagliatelli and the people that don't really want to dick around with a lot of stuff like that is just use water test strips to know if there's a problem and then figure it out. So this is my new opinion of the nitrogen cycle parameters. I think all cases should start with a water test strip like the 6-in-1, which gives pH, ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, and carbonate alkalinity, and that's a big win. I would take that a step further at this point, though, by mentioning that constant water replacement fixes most problems with with background pollution. By constantly replacing water up to 10, even 20% per day, very gradually over time, realizing it's a trickle system, and this is especially true in retail facilities, you avoid almost all issues with accumulated carbon dioxide, nitrogen compounds, derangements in the nitrogen cycle, sagging oxygen levels, and even the persistence of parasites in some cases, because certain parasites like Epistylus and Trichodina kind of depend on organically rich, if not actually dirty water to flourish. So if you're replacing lots of water every day, but again, by a trickle system, so your chlorine doesn't matter, and the chloramines don't matter, and the fish aren't shocked by temperature changes with the fill and drain water change, I think you'll find a lot of times that your water quality is excellent. I am using overflow water filtration with every system I have, at least over 5 gallons. It's kind of hard to overflow a 5-gallon all the time. Besides constant water replacement, it also bears mentioning that most issues with the nitrogen cycle can be remedied with inoculation or bioseeding of a system suffering with high nitrogen levels with beneficial bacteria from healthy systems already at some degree of equilibrium. Basically, you're harvesting bacteria from an established system at equilibrium. It's got slimy sides and bioactive filtration media, the kind of filtration media that if you give it a squeeze, you get brown, healthy brown, loamy smelling squeezins. Well, those are gold. Those squeezins can cycle another system of the same size with just a gallon of tainted water that way. Sure, there's a chance that you could bring in a bad bacteria or some sort of parasite. You have to weigh the risks to the benefits, but I often think that a couple doses of formalin malachite green are quicker and easier than running a 6-week water quality cycle to its terminus. Now, you might say, what do I need to know about bioseeding? I want to know what the water looks like. I want to know if there's any precautions as far as the pH, because there are. What to look for when I'm bioseeding. How would you bioseed a system that already had fish in it? All of this is described on my website in detail with images. And if you have any questions about it, of course, there's contact in the website on my website, drjohnson.com. So exhaustively dealt with. And, of course, in the live presentation, I'll be open for questions and all of that. So now there's I've said this before, and I kind of think it's true. The question, though, why do you think that crowding is the most important water quality parameter that you can measure? And there's a lot of reasons. And actually, I think somebody that heard the question that had been at this a long time would say, well, yeah, of course, I don't think of crowding as a water quality parameter. But if you did think of it as a water quality parameter, it really is the most important one, because if you don't crowd your fish, you are very unlikely to have a water quality parameter problem. If you're keeping 1/4 of an inch of fish in 10 gallons of water, the odds of you having a problem are very, very low. They're not loading the system up with a lot of carbon dioxide. They're not crapping and peeing a lot in the system. You're not feeding a lot. So a low crowding density is going to have higher quality of water, better water parameters, less sag on the pH, and that sort of thing. And these people are just going to have less trouble. So to say that water quality is tied to crowding is very, very true. And if you were measuring a water quality parameter, the crowding of the system may be the most important because it is a non-indirect way of controlling everything. I said all that, and you might say, well, okay, what constitutes crowding? So let me give you some guidelines. If you have 1/4 of an inch of fish in 10 gallons of water in your pond, your chances of having a problem are very low. In fact, until you get up to 3/4 to 1 inch of fish per 10 gallons of water, you're really going to be pretty much okay. So 1/4 inch of fish in 10 gallons, negligible. 1 inch of fish in 10 gallons of water can be carried by most average filtration, average feeding rates, average water changes, etc. When you get over 1 inch of fish in 10 gallons of water, things start to get a little bit more interesting. And by the time you get to 4 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water, you need to be pretty darn good at water quality. Or that kind of crowding is going to be a powder keg. If a parasite gets into the system, the fish are already going to be under a degree of stress, psychologically being packed in together like that, but also as far as proximity. 4 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water is fish on top of each other, and if a parasite gets in there, they are going to tear it up. Water quality also sags at that level because there is a lot of carbon dioxide flying around, low oxygen levels flying around, and the potential for bacterial hazes is crazy. And then you might say, oh, wait a minute. At retail, we're at 4 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water instantly. Yeah, that's kind of why we're having this class and this video, because you guys got to know how to manage and improve water quality. And I think some of the most important take-homes are frequent, for you guys that are keeping the fish at 4 inches of fish for 10 gallons or more, is frequent testing for problems in the nitrogen cycle. I would have water test strips done every day in a retail facility, watching for elevations in ammonia and nitrate. I would have constant water replacement so that the fish, instead of being a fish in 4 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water, they feel like they're really more like 2 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water, because you're replacing so much water all the time in a trickle. I think that you might feed sparingly, and you definitely need to keep your eye on the pH, because carbon dioxide drops the pH, especially in soft water. So basically, like I said, crowding is a crucially important parameter. And if you're talking to somebody at home and you go out to their pond or whatever, and you're advising them, and you can see the fish are 2 inches of fish in 10 gallons of water or more, and the filtration is just average, you're going to need to suggest those people cull or remove some of the unwanted fish. And you might have to help them with that, because accessing these fish, a lot of which are just brown goldfish, can be kind of difficult. So it might be a drain of the pond to get to these things. My website also describes ways of depopulating a pond. For example, if you were to want to cut the population down drastically, you could pull all the fish that are really important, and then there are certain chemicals that you can use to thin out, specifically the goldfish, or if you really just wanted to get rid of a particular color of fish, you could just remove all the fish of the color you want, and then you could treat the pond with rotenone or triple or quadruple dose potassium permanganate, something like that. And of course, animal rights people are going to jump all over this if they care. But what are you going to do? So, best I can tell, that's a pretty good overview. I did not dissect the nitrogen cycle. What did I do instead? When I picked up the nitrogen cycle, I talked about testing it, and then some ideas of ways to control and curb problems related to it. Talked a little bit about oxygenation and carbon dioxide and some of those impacts. Not usually a problem in an ecosystem pond, We talked a little bit about hazes and water clarity, and sometimes those hazes really, really matter when they're bacterial, and sometimes those hazes don't really matter at all when it's just a slight Greenwater haze. You may have questions about how to control Greenwater hazes and green water. I have videos on that, but you can also ask in this seminar. So, thank you so much for your attention and listening to me ramble on about water quality. This video is slightly shorter than the hour that I will give in the seminar, but we're going to have room for questions. So thank you so much for your attention.